There's a question that serious researchers, fringe theorists, and mainstream archaeologists all quietly wrestle with when they sit long enough with Sumerian texts. Not whether the gods were real, not whether the flood happened. Something more specific. Something the tablets keep returning to in ways that don't fit neatly into either mythology or history. Why did the Sumerians organize their non-human entities into categories? Not one type of divine being, not a vague pantheon of gods who did god things. Distinct categories, with distinct physical descriptions, distinct behaviors, distinct relationships to Earth itself. Organized with the same systematic precision the Sumerians applied to grain inventories and astronomical records. That organizational structure is what we're exploring today. Because if you set aside the question of whether any of it is literally true, and just ask why an ancient civilization would structure their accounts of non-human contact this way, the answer that emerges is genuinely strange. And one category in particular has no ending written for it. If ancient mysteries and the questions mainstream history doesn't like sitting with are your thing, subscribe. We go deep every week. What the tablets actually say. Real Sumerian texts, the ones sitting in the British Museum, the Oriental Institute, and the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, do describe multiple categories of non-human beings. This isn't speculation, it's documented. Scholars of ancient Mesopotamia have long noted that Sumerian cosmological texts distinguish between different classes of divine or semi-divine entities with unusual specificity. The Anunnaki, the Igigi, entities described as coming from the sky, entities described as emerging from beneath the earth or sea, beings described as already present before the gods arrived. Mainstream scholarship interprets all of this as mythology. Theological world building. The same way ancient Greeks distinguished between Titans and Olympians, or Hindus distinguished between Devas and Asuras. That's the accepted interpretation. And it's probably correct. But here's the question the what-if community keeps raising, and it's worth taking seriously as a thought experiment. What if the categorical structure wasn't theological? What if it was observational? Because the organizational logic of Sumerian non-human entities doesn't map cleanly onto how human beings typically build religious pantheons. It maps more cleanly onto something else entirely. A field taxonomy. Category 1. The ones who descended. Across multiple genuine Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are described with consistent physical characteristics. Tall, powerful, arriving from the sky or from a distant celestial body. Their interactions with humans are practical rather than mystical. They establish cities, they assign labor, they transfer knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, and writing. The ancient astronaut interpretation, and let's be clear, this is a speculative theory with no direct supporting evidence, proposes that these descriptions are literal accounts of extraterrestrial beings who made contact with early human civilization. The mainstream interpretation is that the Anunnaki were storm gods and earth gods, whose attributes got systematically organized as Sumerian priestly culture became more sophisticated. Both interpretations agree on one thing. The Sumerians describe this category of beings as arriving, spending an extended period on Earth, and then departing or withdrawing from direct contact. There's a beginning and an end to their presence in the texts. Category 2. The ones already here. This is where Sumerian cosmology gets genuinely interesting from a structural standpoint. Several authentic Sumerian texts describe entities that weren't visitors at all, beings associated with the deep earth, the primordial ocean called the Abzu, or the space between the Earth's surface and the sky. The god Enki, one of the most significant figures in Sumerian cosmology, is consistently associated with the Abzu, described not as coming from elsewhere, but as originating from within the Earth itself. Whether you read this literally or metaphorically, the categorical distinction is deliberate. The Sumerians were separating beings who arrived from beings who were already present. From a purely speculative standpoint, that's a meaningful distinction to preserve across thousands of years of oral tradition before it was committed to clay. If you were constructing a mythology from scratch, you might not bother making that distinction at all. Many mythologies don't. The Sumerians kept it consistently. Why? No definitive answer. But the question is worth sitting with. Category 3. The builders. Sumerian texts describe specific divine entities whose primary function wasn't governance or knowledge transfer, but physical construction. The god Enki designs the city of Eridu. Divine beings establish the boundaries of the first cities. Entities described in the Eridu Genesis are specifically tasked with creating infrastructure. Again, mainstream interpretation. These are mythological explanations for how civilization began, projecting divine agency onto human achievement. The speculative interpretation that some researchers propose. These accounts preserve distorted memories of an actual period when beings with advanced construction knowledge directed or assisted early human architectural and agricultural development. There's no physical evidence that supports the speculative version over the mainstream one. What's archaeologically documented is that Sumerian civilization did appear to develop with unusual speed compared to surrounding cultures. The gap between scattered Ubaid settlements and the organized urban civilization of early Sumer is compressed in ways that historians still debate. That compression is real. The explanation for it is not settled. Category 4. The Watchers. This is one of the most consistent cross-cultural figures in ancient literature, and it appears in Sumerian texts in a form that predates its appearances elsewhere. Beings whose function is observation, not interaction, not construction, not governance, watching. The Sumerian texts that reference this category describe entities maintaining awareness of human activity without direct participation. In later texts derived from Sumerian tradition, this category becomes more explicitly defined. But the origin in Sumerian cosmology is notable because it's the earliest known instance of this specific figure, the non-intervening observer. From a speculative standpoint, the consistency of this figure across ancient cultures separated by geography and time is genuinely puzzling. The Watcher shows up in Mesopotamian texts, in pre-biblical Semitic literature, in certain Vedic references, in indigenous traditions across multiple continents. Mythologists attribute this to convergent narrative evolution. Humans across cultures independently developed the concept of divine observers because it served similar theological functions. That's probably the right answer. But the alternative theory, that the consistency reflects a shared ancient experience that got filtered through different cultural frameworks, is at least interesting to consider as a thought experiment. Category 5. The Small Travelers. Here's where the Sumerian taxonomic structure gets into territory that modern readers find hardest to categorize. Several texts reference entities operating at scales that weren't directly visible to human observers. Presences described through their effects rather than their appearance. Forces that moved through living things without causing harm. Agents of change operating below the threshold of ordinary perception. Mainstream interpretation. Spiritual forces. Divine influence manifesting in the natural world. Standard theological language. The speculative interpretations some researchers find compelling. These passages might represent ancient attempts to describe biological or microbial phenomena that Sumerian observers couldn't see directly, but could observe the effects of. Sudden changes in plant growth, animal behavior, human health. Effects without visible causes. Whether that's a reasonable reading or a significant overreach is genuinely debatable. But it's an interesting structural question. Why would a civilization building a taxonomy of non-human entities include a category for things too small to see? That's not an obvious theological move. Category 6. The ones who left something behind. Across multiple genuine Sumerian texts, there are references to objects, locations, and pieces of knowledge that were given to humanity by non-human entities, and then those entities departed. The me, described in real Sumerian texts, are the fundamental principles of civilization. Writing, law, mathematics, music, metalworking. The texts describe these as gifts transferred from divine beings to humanity, not developed by humans independently, handed over. Mainstream interpretation. This is how pre-scientific cultures explain the origins of their own innovations. By attributing them to the gods, they preserved cultural memory of these developments, while embedding them in a sacred framework that protected and transmitted them. The speculative interpretation. The me represent actual technology or knowledge transferred during a period of contact, and the Sumerian texts are preserving the memory of that transfer in the only language available to them. What's genuinely interesting here, regardless of which interpretation you favor, is the departure structure. The beings who gave the me left. The texts are consistent about this. The gift was given, the givers went away, which makes the final category the most structurally significant thing in all of Sumerian cosmological literature. Category 7. The ones with no departure written. Every category of non-human entity in Sumerian texts has some form of withdrawal or departure or reduction in direct activity across the arc of the literature. Except one. There is a consistent set of references across genuine Sumerian texts to beings described as integrated into the fabric of the natural world. Not visiting Earth, not governing it from above. Present within it in a way the Sumerians didn't categorize as temporary. The boundary between this category and the ordinary natural world is described as having dissolved over time. Not because these beings left, but because the distinction between them and the living world stopped being meaningful to track. Scholars read this as standard animist theology, the divine present in nature, a completely reasonable interpretation with strong comparative support across world religions. But the speculative reading that some researchers find compelling is more specific. What if this category preserves the memory of beings who didn't leave because they stopped being separable from Earth's biological systems? Not metaphorically present in nature, actually integrated, biologically absorbed into the living world in a way that made continued separate categorization impossible. No evidence supports this reading over the theological one, but it's the reading that produces the title of this video, and it's worth understanding why it's compelling, even if it's almost certainly not literally true. Because the Sumerians were meticulous categorizers. They kept careful track of who arrived and who left, and one category has no departure record. Not because the text is damaged, not because the information was lost, but because as far as the Sumerians could tell, the story hadn't ended. What this actually tells us. Here's what we can say with confidence, setting speculation entirely aside. The Sumerians built one of the most sophisticated cosmological taxonomies in the ancient world. They didn't describe a single undifferentiated divine realm. They constructed categories. They tracked arrivals and departures. They distinguished between entities by function, origin, scale, and relationship to Earth's surface. That organizational sophistication is itself historically significant. It tells us something about how Sumerian thinkers approached the question of what existed beyond ordinary human experience. Systematically, empirically by the standards available to them. Whether their categories mapped onto anything real outside their own cultural framework is a question that can't be definitively answered. The speculative theories that propose literal extraterrestrial contact are exactly that. Speculative, unproven. Interesting as thought experiments, but without physical evidence. What's not speculative is the structure itself, and the structure has one open category, one set of beings with no exit recorded, one entry in the ancient taxonomy where the Sumerian scribes, who tracked everything, left the departure line blank. You can decide what you think that means, but the next time you're outside at night, looking at something moving through the grass or the water or the dark between the trees, consider the possibility that the Sumerians thought about that too, and considered it worth writing down, separately. That's the story of the Sumerian species catalog and the category with no ending. If ancient history and the questions it leaves open are what you're here for, subscribe. Next week, we're going into the pre-flood cartography that matches modern satellite imaging in ways nobody has adequately explained.